The fluorescent light in the CVS bathroom flickered with a low, aggressive hum that felt like it was drilling directly into my temple. It smelled like cheap lavender cleaner trying desperately to cover up desperation and regret. Fitting, really. I sat on the closed toilet lid, my jeans around my ankles, staring at the little plastic stick in my trembling hand. 2 lines. 2 very pink, very undeniable lines. "Are you kidding me?" I whispered to the empty stall. My voice cracked. I closed my eyes, running the math in my head at warp speed. Rent was due in 4 days. My checking account had exactly $112 in it. Tyrell hadn't paid his share of the utilities in 2 months because his music career was about to pop off, which mostly meant he needed money for studio time that never resulted in actual songs. And now this. A baby. A baby brought into a 1-bedroom apartment in Queens with leaky faucets and a boyfriend who still thought doing the dishes constituted a major life achievement. I shoved the test into the front pocket of my hoodie, pulled up my jeans and flushed the toilet just for the noise. I didn't want to think about it. If I thought about it, I'd scream, and the teenage cashier out front looked too bored to deal with a hysterical woman in aisle 4. I washed my hands in the lukewarm water, avoiding my own reflection in the scratched mirror. I looked tired. I felt tired deep in my bones, a weariness that sleep wasn't going to fix. I walked out of the bathroom, past racks of discounted Easter candy, and stepped out into the cool evening air. My phone buzzed violently in my pocket against my thigh, right next to the plastic stick that had just ruined my life. I pulled it out. Angela's contact photo, a selfie of us grinning with margarita glasses the size of our heads, lit up the screen. I almost sent it to voicemail. I didn't have the bandwidth for Angela drama right now. Angela's drama usually involved blowing $300 on shoes she couldn't walk in, or crying because a bartender didn't text her back. My drama currently involved creating an entire human being while broke. But she called again immediately. I sighed, sliding my thumb across the screen. "Ange, listen, I'm really not in the mood for—" "Liorah. Oh my God, Liorah, pick up, oh thank God." Her voice stopped me cold. Angela sounded wrecked. Not he didn't text back wrecked. She sounded breathless, genuinely terrified, like she was hiding in a closet from an axe murderer. "Whoa, hey, breathe," I said, stepping away from the store entrance, my own panic momentarily shelved. "What's wrong? Are you hurt?" "No, yes, I don't know, I'm sick. I've been throwing up all morning, I can barely stand up." The lie sounded thin, desperate, but the fear behind it was real. "Liorah, I need you, I am begging you, this is life or death." I frowned, leaning against the brick wall of the pharmacy. "Angela, slow down. If you're sick, go to urgent care. What do you need me for?" "I can't go to urgent care. It's this family thing tonight. This heritage gala bullshit I told you about." I vaguely remembered her complaining about some super-secret, high-society cultural event her distant relatives were forcing her to attend. Angela was always weird about her extended family. She called them cultish old money and avoided them like the plague. "Okay, so don't go," I said. "Tell them you have food poisoning." "You don't understand," she whispered, the sound vibrating with intensity. "I can't just not go. If someone doesn't show up to represent my line, it's bad. They take this tradition stuff seriously, like scary seriously." "Okay, that sounds insane, Ange. Are you in trouble with these people?" "I will be if I'm not there. Liorah, please." Her voice cracked, dropping into a sob. "I need you to go for me." Silence stretched between us. A delivery truck rumbled past, kicking up dust. "You want me to what?" "Go in my place, just for the opening ceremony part. It's an hour tops. You look enough like me from a distance. Same height, same build if you wear your hair up. Nobody there has seen me since I was 10. They won't know the difference. Just stand there, smile, drink their expensive champagne and leave. Please. I'm terrified of what happens if that seat is empty." It was the stupidest plan I'd ever heard. It sounded like the plot of a bad sitcom. "Angela, this is ridiculous. I can't just impersonate you at some rich people's party." "You have to. You're the only person I trust, the only one. I sent an Uber for you. It's outside the CVS right now. There's a dress in the back seat. I pushed off the wall, looking around. Sure enough, a sleek black sedan that cost more than my yearly tuition was idling at the curb, hazard lights blinking softly. You tracked my phone? I asked, incredulous. I'm desperate, she choked out. Please, Lee, do this for me. I swear I'll owe you for the rest of my life. Just get in the car. My hand brushed the pregnancy test in my pocket again. I thought about going back to my apartment. Tyrell would be on the couch, surrounded by snack wrappers, asking what's for dinner. I'd have to look at him and tell him our messy, barely scraping by life was about to get a whole lot harder. The thought made my stomach turn over. I looked at the expensive car. An hour of pretending to be someone else. An hour of drinking champagne I couldn't afford in a room full of stuffy rich people who cared way too much about heritage. It was insane. It was reckless. It was exactly the distraction I needed. Fine, I said, my voice flat, but you owe me, big time. Oh my God, thank you. Just don't talk to anyone, okay? Just stand there and look bored. You're good at that. Love you too, bitch, I muttered, hanging up. I walked toward the black car, pulling my hoodie tighter around me. I didn't know what kind of weird family drama Angela was dodging, but it couldn't possibly be worse than my own reality waiting for me at home. I opened the back door and slid onto the leather seat. It smelled like new money and expensive sandalwood. A garment bag sat next to me. Miss Angela? The driver asked, his eyes meeting mine in the rearview mirror. They were unnervingly intense, dark and sharp. I hesitated for a second, the lie tasting sour on my tongue. Yeah, I said, sinking back into the seat. That's me. Let's get this over with. The ride was 40 minutes of suffocating silence. The driver, whose neck was thicker than my thigh, didn't say a word. He just drove the sleek black beast of a car with terrifying precision, weaving through traffic like the other vehicles were merely suggestions. I spent the time in the back seat trying to stop my hands from shaking, staring at the garment bag next to me like it contained a bomb instead of a dress. I was insane. I was actually insane. I had a positive pregnancy test burning a hole in the pocket of my faded jeans, and instead of dealing with that reality, I was about to commit light identity fraud at a rich people's mixer. We're here, Miss Angela, the driver rumbled. His voice was so deep I felt it vibrate through the floor mats. I looked out the tinted window and my breath hitched. You've got to be kidding me, I muttered. I expected a rented catering hall, maybe a nice hotel ballroom in Manhattan. This was a fortress disguised as a mansion. It sat behind wrought iron gates somewhere upstate, surrounded by enough perfectly manicured dark woods to hide a dozen bodies. The place looked like Bruce Wayne's summer home, all severe stone and towering glass, glowing with golden light against the darkening sky. There is a changing area just inside the east entrance, the driver said, pulling up to a side door that looked grander than the main entrance of my apartment building. Your presence is required in the main hall immediately after. It wasn't a request. I grabbed the garment bag, mumbled a thanks, and got out. The air up here felt different, thinner, sharper, smelling faintly of pine and something else, something metallic like ozone before a thunderstorm. The changing area was a marble-floored anteroom with mirrors that probably cost more than my college education. I unzipped the bag. Angela, that dramatic bitch, had outdone herself. The dress was emerald green silk, slippery and cool to the touch. It looked impossibly expensive. I stripped off my hoodie and jeans, feeling exposed in the vast, echoing room, and stepped into the silk. It fits like a conspiracy. It clung to every curve, the slit up the thigh high enough to be dangerous, the neckline plunging just enough to make Tyrell lose his mind if he ever saw it. I looked at myself in the mirror. The rich green against my deep skin tone was stunning, I had to admit. I didn't look like Liorah from Queens who was late on her electric bill. I looked like money. I threw my hair up into a messy bun, letting a few tendrils fall around my face, applied a layer of red lipstick I found in the clutch Angela had left with the dress, and took a deep breath. Showtime, I whispered to my reflection. My stomach growled violently in response. Right. Pregnant. Starving. I pushed through the heavy oak doors and stepped into the main hall. The sheer volume of the space hit me first. It was cavernous, with ceilings vanishing into shadow way overhead, and chandeliers the size of compact cars hanging down, dripping with crystal. Then, the silence hit me. There must have been 200 people in the room, but it was unnervingly quiet. No boisterous laughter, no clinking glasses, just a low murmur of voices that sounded more like strategizing than socializing. And then, I really looked at the people. My skin prickled, a primal warning system going off that my brain didn't know how to interpret. Everyone was beautiful, not just attractive, but intimidatingly flawless. But it was the energy in the room that was bizarre. The men were huge, almost uniformly tall, broad-shouldered, filling out their impeccable tailored suits in a way that suggested coiled violence underneath the expensive fabric. They didn't walk, they stalked. They moved with a fluid, predatory grace that made me instinctively want to back up against a wall. Their eyes were intense, scanning the room like they were assessing threats or acquisitions. And the women? They were dressed in gowns as stunning as mine, shimmering in jewels, but they held themselves like exquisite furniture waiting to be arranged. They stood near the walls or in small, quiet clusters, eyes often cast downward. There was a strange, thick submissiveness hanging over them that made my skin crawl. It looked like a very expensive, very well-dressed cult. Angela had called this a heritage event. It felt more like a livestock auction where the livestock wore Prada. I felt dozens of eyes shift toward me as I stepped fully into the room. The weight of their collective gaze was heavy, physical. A few of the massive men tracked my movement, their nostrils flaring slightly, which was weird as hell. I fought the urge to tug down the hem of my dress. Instead, I lifted my chin. If I was going to pretend to be Angela, the girl who once threw a drink in a bouncer's face because he looked at her wrong, I couldn't look intimidated. Besides, I was too hungry to be scared. I scanned the room, ignoring the intense stares of the men and the demure glances of the women. I wasn't looking for cultural enrichment. I was looking for the buffet. I spotted a long table laden with silver platters near the far wall. Thank God. I started walking toward it, my heels clicking sharply on the marble floor in the near silence. I felt like I was walking through a minefield, but the promise of tiny crab cakes was a powerful motivator. As I passed a group of 3 enormous men in charcoal suits, one of them turned fully towards me. He was devastatingly handsome in a brutal kind of way, but his stare was so intense it felt like a physical shove. I didn't lower my eye like the other women. I just raised an eyebrow at him, gave a dismissive little shrug, and kept walking toward the food. I heard a sharp intake of breath from somewhere behind me, but I didn't care. Let them stare. I had an hour to kill, a baby to figure out, and I needed a shrimp cocktail immediately. The crab cakes were disappointingly mostly filler. The shrimp cocktail, however, was passable. I snagged 2 more from the silver platter, dodging the gaze of a waiter who looked like he could bench press the entire table, and retreated to a relatively empty corner near a massive, imposing fireplace that wasn't lit. I popped the second shrimp into my mouth, sighing with the kind of relief only a hungry pregnant woman could feel. My phone buzzed again in the small clutch Angela had left. I pulled it out. A text from Tyrell. "Where you at? Got a plan for tonight?" I snorted aloud, a harsh, unladylike sound that echoed in the hushed room. A plan for tonight. Right. His plan probably involved me picking up a pizza and him maybe washing a dish if I was lucky. The sound of my own amusement was like a rock thrown into a still pond. The low murmur of the room didn't just dip, it died. The silence that fell was absolute, suffocating. I froze, shrimp halfway to my mouth, and looked up. Every single person in the cavernous hall was looking in one direction. Not at me, past me, toward the towering oak doors at the far end of the room, the ones I had just come through. They were opening, slowly. And then he walked in. If the other men in the room were large, this man was a monument. He was impossibly tall, his shoulders broad enough to block out the light from the doorway. He wore a black suit, tailored so perfectly it looked like it had been grown on him, but it didn't look expensive like the others. It looked dangerous, like it was barely containing something that wanted to tear through the seams. He wasn't handsome in a way that made you want to sigh. He was handsome in a way that made your breath catch in your throat, a sharp, angular kind of beauty that belonged on a statue in a war museum. His face was made of hard lines and colder shadows, and his eyes, even from across the vast room, were an icy, arresting blue that looked like they could freeze water at a glance. He didn't walk. He flowed into the room like a glacier, slow and unstoppable. The air in the hall seemed to drop 10 degrees. The 200 people in the room didn't just go quiet. They physically reacted. The enormous, prowling men seemed to shrink, their shoulders bunching defensively. The women dipped their heads, some even dropping into slight curtsies. It was a wave of complete, terrifying submission. Except for me. I was still standing by the fireplace, holding a shrimp, the phone still in my hand, staring at this man like he was a particularly interesting car accident. And then the craziest thing happened. He stopped, dead. His head snapped towards me, those arctic eyes locking onto mine with laser precision. It was an intense physical sensation, like being caught in a spotlight. The silence in the room deepened, if that was even possible. It felt like the air itself was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to happen. He started walking, not toward the center of the room, toward me. My heart gave a weird, frantic flutter, but it wasn't fear. It was adrenaline? Confusion? He moved with a lethal grace that was mesmerizing, but it was also incredibly rude. He stopped 3 feet in front of me. Up close, he was even more overwhelming. His presence was a physical force, a pressure against my skin that made the hair on my arms stand up. I had to tilt my head back just to meet his gaze. He stared at me for a long, excruciating moment. His nostrils flared slightly, and I saw a flicker of something, not interest, not anger, confusion, disgust. It was hard to tell on a face that was still a stone. "Who do you belong to?" His voice was low, a rumble that I felt in my chest more than I heard. It wasn't a polite inquiry. It was a demand for information. I blinked. "Excuse me?" His jaw tightened just a fraction. "Which line claimed you? You have no scent." "Scent? Claimed? What was this guy talking about? Was this some weird rich person game?" "I don't belong to anyone," I said, my voice sounding a little too loud in the silent room. "My landlord mostly, I guess." I realized too late it was a stupid thing to say. A tiny, horrified gasp rippled through the room. His eyes narrowed, the blue ice hardening. He didn't move, but the pressure in the air around him intensified. It felt like the room was shrinking. "You are unclaimed," he stated, not as a question but as a fact he found deeply offensive. "And yet, you are here." He took another half step towards me. I should have been terrified. Any sane person would have been. This man was clearly dangerous, and the way everyone else was terrified of him was a pretty big clue. But I was exhausted, pregnant, and still holding a shrimp. And he was just so much. "Yeah, I'm here," I said, fighting the urge to step back, holding my ground with a defiance I didn't know I possessed. "Is there a problem with that? You gonna call security or something?" The silence in the room was now deafening. I saw one of the large men nearby flinch, as if he expected the floor to open up and swallow me whole. The Ice King, as I'd started calling him in my head, didn't blink. He just stared down at me, his expression unreadable, but the air around him crackled with an intensity that made my skin tingle. "There is a problem," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, cold and clinical. "You are an anomaly." He turned his head slightly, not looking away from me, and made a sharp, dismissive gesture with his hand. 2 of the largest men in the room, who had been hovering nearby, immediately moved toward us. "Tag her," he commanded, his voice a whip crack in the silence. "Hold her for processing." Tag me? Processing? Before I could even process what he was saying, the 2 men were on either side of me. They didn't touch me, but they flanked me, blocking any escape route, their sheer size a wall of intimidation. "Wait, what?" I sputtered, looking between the two behemoths and the Ice King, who was already turning away, as if I was a piece of misplaced luggage he'd dealt with. "You can't just—" "Do not resist," one of the men flanking me grunted, his voice deep and rough. "Move." It wasn't a suggestion. I was being detained, and the Ice King was walking away, the crowd parting for him like the Red Sea without a backward glance. I'm pregnant, not stupid. When two men built like industrial refrigerators tell you to move, you move, especially when they're working for a guy who can make a room full of rich people act like whipped dogs. "Tag her," the Ice King had said, processing. My brain was still trying to catch up to the reality of what was happening. I was being, what, arrested, detained, abducted by a very strange, very wealthy cult? The two guards, let's call them Frick and Frack, though they looked more like pain and suffering, flanked me as we walked. They didn't touch me, but their sheer presence was a physical barrier, a moving wall of muscle and expensive fabric. They marched me out of the main hall, past the terrified stares of the other guests, and through a side door I hadn't noticed before. The door led to a long, dimly lit corridor that smelled of old money and ozone. The air was cooler here, or maybe that was just my own panic starting to set in. "Where are you taking me?" I asked, my voice a little too high, a little too breathy. I tried to sound authoritative like Angela would have, but it came out more like a frightened squeak. Neither of them answered. They just kept walking, their strides long and synchronized. "Hello? I asked you a question," I said, trying to sound less like a panicked rabbit and more like a furious woman. "You can't just kidnap people. This is kidnapping." Frack, the one on my left, let out a low, rough sound that was almost a growl. Silence. It wasn't a request. It was a command, delivered with a menacing weight that made my stomach lurch. I shut up. We reached the end of the hallway and stopped in front of a pair of elevator doors that looked like they belonged in a bank vault. Frick pressed a button, and the doors slid open silently. I was ushered inside, and the doors closed with a pneumatic hiss that felt final. The elevator started to ascend, and my stomach did a nervous flip that had nothing to do with the crab cakes. "Look," I said, trying a different approach. "I think there's been a mistake. My friend Angela asked me to come here. I'm not supposed to be here. If you just let me go, I'll—" Frick turned his head slowly, his eyes hard and unyielding. "You will speak only when spoken to by the Alpha." The Alpha. Right. The Ice King. The elevator doors opened onto a space that made the opulent hall downstairs look like a Motel 6. It was a penthouse, I realized, the entire top floor of the massive mansion. It was stunning and terrifying. The walls were all glass, floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out onto a sea of dark treetops and the distant, glittering lights of a city. The furniture was sparse and modern, made of steel and dark leather and polished stone. There were no personal touches, no photos, no books, no plants. It was flawless, cold, and utterly devoid of warmth. It felt like a very expensive prison cell. The air here was frigid, like someone had left a window open in the middle of winter. I shivered, wrapping my arms around myself. "Wait here," Frick said, pointing to a spot in the middle of the polished concrete floor. "Do not move." And then they both turned and walked back to the elevator, leaving me alone in the echoing silence. The doors hissed shut behind them. I was trapped. I stood there for a moment, too stunned to move. My heart was pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I looked around, my mind racing. Was there a way out? A phone? A window that wasn't sealed shut? I walked over to the massive windows. The view was breathtaking, a vast expanse of darkness dotted with distant lights. But it was a long, long way down. I turned back to the room. There had to be something. A phone on a desk, a tablet, anything. I started to move toward a large, polished desk in the corner, my heels clicking loudly on the concrete. The elevator doors hissed open again. And he stepped out. The Alpha. The Ice King. The man who had ordered me tagged and processed. He had shed his jacket, and the shirt sleeves of his black button-down were rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms that were covered in swirling, intricate tattoos. They looked primal. He stopped just inside the elevator, his eyes locking onto mine instantly. It was the same intense, unsettling stare from the hall. He didn't say anything. He just stood there, a statue made of ice and silent menace, filling the space with his overwhelming presence. The air in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. I stopped mid-stride, feeling absurdly small and vulnerable in the vast, cold room. My breath caught in my throat. I was alone with him, and I had absolutely no idea what he was going to do. He started walking toward me, slowly, deliberately. Every step was a silent threat. I instinctively took a step back, my heart hammering against my ribs. I didn't know what he was, or what this place was, or why I was here, but I knew one thing with absolute certainty. I was terrified, and I was trapped. The elevator doors hissed open again, revealing the Ice King in all his frozen glory. He stood there for a beat, those arctic eyes scanning the room before locking onto me with that same unnerving intensity. I didn't move. I was already standing in the middle of the room, shivering slightly in the ridiculous emerald silk, feeling about as welcome as a case of the flu. The air up here was even colder than it had been downstairs, a sterile, refrigerated chill that made the goosebumps on my arms ache. He walked towards me, every step slow and deliberate, like he was approaching a bomb he wasn't sure how to defuse. The air around him crackled with that same strange, heavy energy I'd felt before, only now, in this silent room, it was almost suffocating. He stopped a few feet away, close enough that I could see the individual fibers of his expensive black shirt and the faint silvery scars that marred his knuckles. He didn't say anything for a long, excruciating moment. He just stared at me, his nostrils flaring slightly, like he was trying to catch a scent that wasn't there. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic little bird trapped in a cage. I wanted to run, to scream, to demand answers, but the sheer force of his presence held me rooted to the spot. It was like being in a cage with a large predatory animal that hadn't decided yet if you were food or a toy. "Who sent you?" he finally asked, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that seemed to vibrate in my chest. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. "Nobody sent me, I told you, I'm just here, I'm a guest." His eyes narrowed, the blue ice hardening. "A guest," he repeated, the word dripping with disdain. "A guest who has no scent, no pack, and who snorts at her phone in the middle of a presentation?" Presentation? Pack? What in the world is he talking about? "I don't know what a presentation is," I said, my voice shaking slightly despite my best efforts. "And I don't know what you mean about a scent. I use deodorant." A muscle twitched in his jaw. He took a step closer, invading my personal space in a way that felt inherently threatening. The air around him was cold, but there was a heat coming off him, a raw, primal energy that made my skin prickle. "Do not lie to me," he growled, his voice lower now, vibrating with a barely contained fury. "You are not just here. You were sent. By whom?" He leaned in closer, his face inches from mine, his eyes searching mine with a terrifying intensity. It felt like he was trying to peer straight into my soul, to rip the truth out of me. And then he sniffed. It was a subtle movement, a slight flaring of his nostrils, but it was undeniable. He was smelling me, like a dog. A wave of hot embarrassment washed over me, followed quickly by a surge of indignation. "Excuse me," I sputtered, taking a step back, my hand instinctively going to my chest. "What are you doing? That's incredibly rude." He didn't back down. In fact, he took another step closer, his eyes narrowing even further. He leaned in again, his nose almost touching my neck, and inhaled deeply. My breath hitched in my throat. This was insane. I was in a penthouse with a man who was smelling me like I was a piece of meat he was considering buying. And then, his entire demeanor changed. His head snapped back, his eyes wide with a look of utter disbelief, followed quickly by a flash of pure, unadulterated rage. The air in the room seemed to crackle with a sudden violent energy. "You," he hissed, the word of venomous accusation. You dare? He reached out, his hand moving with a speed that blurred, and grabbed my wrist. His grip was like iron, painfully tight, and I gasped, trying to pull away. Let me go, I cried, struggling against his hold. What is wrong with you? I haven't done anything. He pulled me closer, his face contorted with a fury that was terrifying to behold. His eyes were no longer just icy, they were burning with a cold, predatory fire. You dare to come here? He snarled, his voice a low, dangerous growl that made my blood run cold. To my territory, stinking of another male. Another male? My mind raced, trying to make sense of his words. Tyrell. He smelled Tyrell on me. But how, and why would that make him so angry? And then another scent hit him. His nostrils flared again, and his eyes widened even further, a look of absolute horror washing over his face. He dropped my wrist as if it were burning him, stumbling back a step as if he'd been physically struck. And that, he whispered, his voice thick with revulsion. The scent of breeding. Breeding. The word hung in the air between us, heavy and ugly. My hand instinctively went to my stomach, a protective gesture I hadn't even realized I was making. He stared at me, his face a mask of disgust and disbelief. He looked at me like I was something foul, something contaminated. You are pregnant, he spat, the words tasting like bile in his mouth. By another male. And you came here. The silence in the room was absolute, suffocating. I stared at him, my mind reeling. He knew. He knew I was pregnant. How could he possibly know? And why was he looking at me like I was a monster? The problem with being kidnapped by a super-rich, emotionally constipated psychopath who thinks I smell like breeding is that it doesn't stop me from being pregnant. And being pregnant means being hungry, constantly. It had been maybe 2 hours since the Ice King, whose actual name I still didn't know and frankly didn't want to ask, had practically thrown me into one of the guest bedrooms. Guest room was generous. It was a grey minimalist box, with a bed that felt like a slab of granite covered in high thread count Egyptian cotton. He'd told me to stay put while he assessed the situation, then locked the door from the outside. Whatever. At least there was an attached bathroom. I'd spent the first hour pacing, trying to get a signal on my phone, dead zone naturally, and mentally drafting text messages to Angela that ranged from WTF to I hope you're actually dying because if not, I'm going to kill you. By hour 2, the adrenaline wore off, replaced by a gnawing emptiness in my stomach that demanded immediate attention. The crab cakes were a distant memory. I tried the bedroom door handle again, still locked. Hello? I banged on the door with the flat of my hand. Hey, Ice Cube, open up, I need food. Silence. I banged harder. Listen, you can keep me prisoner, that's fine. Very dramatic, A+ for effort. But if you starve a pregnant woman, I'm pretty sure that's a violation of the Geneva Convention. Also, I get very mean when my blood sugar drops. You do not want to see me angry in this dress. A moment later, there was a sharp click, and the door swung open. It wasn't the Ice King. It was Frack, the slightly wider of the 2 human refrigerators from earlier. He stared down at me with an expression that suggested I was a particularly annoying stain on the carpet. I'm hungry, I said, crossing my arms over my emerald silk chest. Point me to the kitchen. He grunted, a sound that seemed to involve way too much chest muscle, and jerked his head toward the main living area. I took that as an invitation and brushed past him. The penthouse was vast, silent, and freezing. I wandered past the area where I'd first met the boss man, eventually locating a kitchen that looked like it belonged in a design magazine, not a home. It was all brushed steel, black marble, and hidden appliances. I started opening cupboards. Nothing. No cereal, no crackers, not even a dusty bag of pasta. I opened the Sub-Zero refrigerator. It contained exactly 3 things. 6 bottles of sparkling water that looked very expensive, a sealed container filled with what looked suspiciously like raw steaks, and a lonely lemon. Are you serious? I muttered to the lemon. What kind of billionaire doesn't have snacks? My stomach growled violently. I needed something soothing, something caloric. I spotted a ridiculously complicated espresso machine built into the wall. Okay, I could work with that. A latte wouldn't solve everything, but it would help. I hunted for milk. Nothing in the main fridge. I found a smaller under-counter fridge near the coffee station. Jackpot. There was a glass pitcher of what looked like whole milk. I paused. Tyrell had got me hooked on oat milk recently. It was easier on my stomach since the pregnancy started. I scanned the fridge again. No oat milk. I turned to Frack, who was hovering by the kitchen entrance like a gargoyle. Hey, do you guys have any oat milk or almond, macadamia nut, anything that didn't come out of a cow? Frack just blinked at me slowly. Right. Good talk. I needed sustenance. The lemon wasn't going to cut it. I remembered seeing a set of double doors down a hallway off the main living room earlier. I'd heard low voices coming from that direction when Frack let me out. Maybe there was food in there, or at least someone smart enough to know what oat milk was. I grabbed an empty ceramic mug from a shelf, heavy enough to be a weapon if necessary, and marched past Frack before he could register what I was doing. Halt, he grumbled behind me, but he was too slow. I reached the double doors. They were imposing, dark wood, probably mahogany harvested from an enchanted forest or something. The voices inside were low and serious. I didn't knock. I was way too hungry for polite social conventions. I pushed one of the heavy doors open and stepped inside. It was a conference room, dominated by a table made of a single slab of polished black wood that seemed to go on forever. The air in here was even colder, if that was possible. Sitting around the table were 12 men. They were all massive, all dressed in dark suits, and all radiating an intensity that would make a normal person wet themselves. Frick was there. So were a bunch of other guys who looked like they ate rocks for breakfast. And at the head of the table, naturally, sat the Ice King. He was leaning over a large, illuminated map spread across the table, his shirt sleeves still rolled up, revealing those intricate primal tattoos. He looked up as the door opened, and the entire room went deadly silent. 12 pairs of terrifying eyes locked onto me. A lesser woman would have fainted. I just held up my empty mug. Sorry to interrupt the villain montage, I said, my voice echoing a little too loudly in the cavernous room, but your kitchen is tragically understocked. Do any of you happen to know where the oat milk is kept? The cow juice makes me gassy. You could hear a pin drop. Seriously. I think one of the guys near the end of the table actually stopped breathing. They all looked from me to the Ice King with expressions of sheer, unadulterated panic. The Ice King slowly straightened up. His face was a mask of icy incredulity. His blue eyes burned with that cold fire again. He didn't shout. He didn't even raise his voice. He just looked at me and then he made a sound. It was a growl, but not like a dog. It was deeper, richer, a vibrating thrum that seemed to come from the center of the earth. It resonated in my chest, a physical pressure against my ribcage. It was a sound designed by nature to make prey freeze and predators submit. Leave. The word wasn't spoken. It was pushed into the air with the force of a physical blow. The guys around the table flinched violently, dropping their gazes to the table. I winced, raising a hand to my ear. It felt like standing next to a subwoofer that had just blown out. Ow, I said, rubbing my temple. I looked at him, genuinely concerned for a second. Geez, do you need a lozenge or something? You sound terrible. My aunt gets like that when her bronchitis flares up. Seriously, that can't be good for your vocal cords. I watched, fascinated, as the Ice King's jaw literally dropped half an inch. The terrifying dominant alpha mask slipped, just for a second, revealing total, baffled confusion. The guy next to Frick let out a tiny, high-pitched squeak of terror. I'd made an impression, I'll give myself that. After my impromptu oat milk inquiry, the air in the room had gone from 0 to awkward in record time. The Ice King, whose expression had shifted from murderous deity to man watching a poodle ride a unicycle, didn't say another word. He just gestured with one tattooed hand, a sharp, dismissive flick of the wrist. Frack, having recovered his ability to breathe, practically carried me back to my grey minimalist cell of a room. He dumped a lukewarm bottle of water and a foil-wrapped protein bar that tasted like chalk and despair onto the bed before slamming the door. The lock clicked emphatically. I ate the chalk bar, I drank the water, I paced. The adrenaline from stumping the alpha was fading, replaced by a creeping cold dread. None of this made sense. The intense men, the sniffing, the breeding comment, the weird vibrating growl that felt like it could crack a rib. And Angela. My phone was still in the pocket of the emerald dress. I pulled it out, staring at the black screen. I'd tried it a dozen times since being locked up. 0 bars. A dead zone. It was too convenient. These people were rich enough to buy God. They could certainly afford cell service blockers. I walked over to the floor-to-ceiling window, pressing my forehead against the freezing glass. The city lights twinkled miles away, a mocking reminder of the normal world I'd been yanked out of. Just as I was about to give up and throw the phone across the room, the screen flickered. 1 bar, one glorious, unstable bar of 4G. I didn't hesitate. I jabbed Angela's contact. It rang, once, twice. "Oh my God, Liorah." Her voice was a wreck, husky, tear-stained, and vibrating with panic. "Angela," I hissed, keeping my voice low, glancing at the door. "What the actual hell is going on? Where am I? Who are these steroid-abusing freaks in suits?" "Oh God, Lee, I'm so sorry, I didn't think— Are you okay? Are you hurt?" She was hyperventilating. I could hear the ragged gasps for air on the other end. "I'm fine, other than being kidnapped and starved," I snapped, the fear momentarily overridden by anger. "Angela, talk to me. You said you were sick. You begged me to wear this stupid dress. You set me up." Silence on the other end, save for her wet breathing. "Angela." "I had to," she whispered, her voice cracking. "I saw them coming, Lee. I saw the blood. I saw what they would do to me, to the baby." I froze. The baby? Angela wasn't pregnant. I was pregnant. "What are you talking about? What did you see?" A horrible chill that had nothing to do with the room's temperature started to spread through my veins. The visions, Lee, they were so strong. They were hunting me, because of what I am, because of what I can see. She was sobbing now, full-blown hysterics. I knew if I went tonight they'd take me, they'd kill me. I needed a diversion, someone they wouldn't expect, someone who didn't smell like us. The pieces clicked together in my mind, forming a picture so ugly I felt sick. The frantic call, the vagueness, the insistence that I wear her dress, use her invitation. "You used me as bait," I said, my voice flat. The betrayal hit me harder than the Ice King's growl. This was my best friend. The woman who held my hair back when I puked after too many tequila shots. The woman I was going to ask to be my baby's godmother. "I didn't have a choice," she wailed. I thought they'd just kick you out once they realized you were human. I didn't think he'd be there. The king wasn't supposed to be there." "The king," I repeated numbly. "Angela, what are these people? What are you?" "I'm so sorry, Lee. I'm so sorry. You have to get out of there. You have to—" The door to my room didn't just open. It slammed against the wall with a force that cracked the plaster. I spun around, dropping the phone. He was there. The king. The brief moment of confusion I'd seen in the war room was gone, replaced by a terrifying glacial clarity. He wasn't wearing the mask of civilized wealth anymore. His eyes were glowing, actually glowing, a predatory blue fire in the dim room. His teeth were bared in a snarl that was way too wide for a human mouth. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor, where Angela's frantic voice was still tinny and small coming from the phone speaker. Liorah, are you there? Oh God, did they find you?" He crossed the room in a blur of movement that my eyes couldn't even track. One second he was at the door, the next he was towering over me, the scent of winter and raw fury rolling off him in waves. He reached down and snatched the phone from the floor. "No!" I gasped, reaching for it. "Don't!" He didn't even look at it. He just closed his fist around the device. There was a sickening crunch of metal and glass, a small spark, and then silence. He opened his hand, letting the twisted remains of my iPhone fall to the concrete floor like confetti. Then he turned those glowing blue eyes on me. My iPhone was dust. Expensive, unpaid-off dust scattered on the polished concrete floor. I stared at the wreckage, my brain trying to process the last 5 minutes. Angela's betrayal, bait, she'd called me bait, was a dull ache in my chest, overshadowed by the immediate reality of the psycho-billionaire towering over me. His chest was heaving, just slightly. That subterranean growl was still vibrating in the air, a physical presence that made the fine hairs on my arms stand up. The blue glow in his eyes had dimmed back to icy chips, but the fury was still there, tightly coiled. "You do not communicate with the outside," he said. His voice was so cold it could have frozen nitrogen. "Not until I know what you are." "I'm a human woman who needed her oat milk," I snapped, bending down to scoop up a piece of twisted metal that used to be my camera lens. "And you owe me $1,200, plus a cancellation fee for my data plan." He looked at me like I'd just asked him to validate parking for a UFO. "Your concern is misplaced." "My concern is that my best friend threw me to the wolves, metaphorically speaking, although with you people who knows, and now I'm trapped in an architectural digest nightmare with no phone and no food." I stood up facing him. The sheer size of him was intimidating, yes, but I was running on adrenaline and pregnancy hormones. I was way past scared, I was furious. "I am leaving, right now." I started to march toward the door. He didn't move to stop me. He didn't have to. Before I reached the exit, the elevator doors down the hall slid open with a soft ding. Frick, the slightly narrower human wall, stepped out, looking agitated. Behind him strode another man. If the Ice King was a glacier, this new guy was an oil slick. He was dressed in a suit that was just a little too shiny, his hair slicked back with enough product to waterproof a duck. He was handsome in a sleazy, used car salesman kind of way, and he carried himself with an arrogance that practically screamed, "Punch me." He wasn't looking at the alpha. He was looking right at me. His nostrils flared wide, taking in a deep, theatrical sniff of the air. A slow, predatory grin spread across his face. It wasn't a friendly smile. It was the look a shark gives a wounded seal. "Well, well," the newcomer purred, his voice like gravel dipped in honey. He sidestepped Frick and walked straight toward me, ignoring the Alpha King entirely. "I heard rumors you picked up a stray tonight, Kenneth. Didn't realize it was such a ripe one." Kenneth. So the Ice King had a name. Kenneth didn't move. He had gone unnervingly still. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees in a second. The oily man stopped inches from me. He was too close. His scent, expensive cologne trying to mask something muskier and unpleasant, cloyed in my throat. He leaned in, sniffing near my neck, unapologetically invading my personal space. "Human," he sneered, pulling back just enough to look me up and down as if I were livestock at an auction. "Weak. Fragile. And what's this underneath? Another male's claim? And oh my." He laughed, a nasty grating sound. "She's breeding, Kenneth. You brought a pregnant human into the penthouse, getting soft in your old age, letting vermin clutter up the territory." He reached out a hand, his fingers brushing my arm. It wasn't a caress, it was a test, a violation. "Don't touch me," I said, batting his hand away. His grin widened, his eyes flashing a sickly yellow color for just a fraction of a second. "Feisty. I like that. Maybe when you're done with your little experiment, Kenneth, you can pass her down to my pack. We could use some entertainment." He reached for me again, bolder this time, his hand aiming for my waist. He never made contact. There was a sound like a whip cracking, and then the world blurred. I blinked. The oily man was no longer in front of me. He was across the room, pinned against the far wall 3 feet off the floor. Kenneth had him by the throat. It had happened so fast my brain hadn't even registered the movement. 1 second Kenneth was a statue by the door, the next he was a blur of violence. The oily man's feet kicked uselessly in the air. His face was turning a lovely shade of plum. Kenneth wasn't just holding him. He was vibrating with lethal energy. The immaculate suit jacket stretched tight across shoulders that seemed wider, more feral than they had a moment ago. And the sound coming from Kenneth wasn't the low thrum from the kitchen. This was a roar but scaled down, compressed into a terrifying, guttural snarl that shook the windows in their frames. Mine! The word wasn't English. It was older. It was a primal declaration of ownership that echoed in the marrow of my bones. The oily man whimpered, clawing feebly at Kenneth's iron grip. Kenneth slammed him against the wall again, hard enough that I heard drywall crack. He leaned in close to the choking man's face, his own features twisted into something barely recognizable as human. His eyes were blazing blue fire, and his teeth, I swear his canines were longer, sharper. "You dare," Kenneth growled, his voice rough with raw, unchecked aggression, "to touch what I have tagged in my domain? You dare insult my territory with your presence?" He threw the man, literally threw him. The oily guy flew 10 feet and landed in a heap near the elevator doors, gasping for air. "Get him out," Kenneth snarled at Frick, not even looking back at the broken heap on the floor. "If he enters the city limits again, bury him." Frick, looking pale, scooped up the gasping visitor and dragged him into the elevator. The doors closed, leaving silence in their wake. Kenneth stood there, chest heaving, his back to me. His hands were clenched into fists at his sides. The air around him crackled, smelling faintly of frost air and burnt sugar. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but it wasn't fear. I should have been terrified. I had just watched a man move faster than physics allowed and nearly crush another man's windpipe with one hand because he touched my arm. But I wasn't scared. I stared at his broad back, the tension radiating off him in waves. The Ice King had melted, and underneath was a volcano. It was brutal. It was monstrous. And Lord Jesus help me, it was the most fascinating thing I had ever seen. The silence that followed the elevator doors closing was heavier than the violence that preceded it. Kenneth stood there, his back to me, a statue carved from tension and expensive tailoring. The air around him still tasted metallic, like the moments before a lightning strike. My brain was trying to file away what I'd just seen. The blur of motion, the inhuman strength, the guttural roar of mine. But my body had other priorities. Specifically, my stomach decided now was the perfect time to revolt against the past 4 hours of stress, kidnapping, and lack of oat milk. The adrenaline that had been propping me up vanished, pulling the rug out from under my circulatory system. The expansive grey room tilted violently to the left. Black spots danced in my peripheral vision, like ink dropped into water. "Oh, that's not good," I mumbled, reaching out for a wall that was suddenly 3 feet further away than it should have been. I swayed. The concrete floor rushed up to meet me with alarming speed. I braced for impact, but it never came. Instead of cracking my skull on polished cement, I was jerked to a halt by an arm like a steel support beam wrapping around my waist. The movement was so fast it gave me whiplash, hauling me upright against a chest that felt less like flesh and bone, and more like a granite slab wearing a silk shirt. The scent of frost air and cold fury washed over me again, so thick I could taste it. It was overwhelming, drowning out the lingering cheap cologne of the oily man. "Breathe," Kenneth commanded. It wasn't a suggestion of comfort. It was an order given to a malfunctioning piece of equipment. I tried to push away, my hands connecting with his rigid chest, but I had the leverage of a wet noodle. "I'm fine," I managed, the words sounding slurred even to my own ears. "Just gravity check." He ignored me. He shifted his grip, scooping me up into his arms as easily as if I were Angela's Pomeranian. I gasped at the sudden elevation change, clutching instinctively at his lapels. His jaw was locked so tight a muscle feathered near his ear. He wasn't looking at me with concern. He was looking at me with profound irritation, like I was a complicated stain on his otherwise pristine existence. "Med team, now," he barked into the empty air. I didn't hear a phone call. I didn't see him press a button, but before he'd even carried me out of the room, I heard the whoosh of another elevator arriving. He didn't take me back to the cell. He carried me down a long, echoing corridor to a part of the penthouse that looked less like an architectural digest spread and more like the intake bay of a very expensive, very private hospital. Stainless steel, monitors with complicated squiggles, and the sharp, stinging smell of antiseptic. He deposited me on a padded examination table that was cold enough to shock me back into semi-consciousness. "Stay," he ordered, pointing a finger at me before backing away 3 paces, as if proximity to me might be contagious. Before I could come up with a scathing retort about not being a golden retriever, the room swarmed. 3 people in dark scrub uniforms, 2 men, 1 woman, all bearing that same intense, humorless efficiency as Frick and Frack, materialized. They didn't ask questions, they just went to work. A blood pressure cuff squeezed my arm. Something cold and metallic was pressed against my chest. A bright light shone in my eyes, blinding me. I tried to protest, to ask what they were doing, but my tongue felt thick and clumsy. "BP is 90/60, heart rate elevated, signs of acute stress response," one of the men murmured. "Draw a panel," the woman ordered, her voice crisp. "Check everything, tox screen, metabolic, HCG. HCG, the pregnancy hormone." A cold spike of real fear pierced the haze. They were going to know. I looked past the swarm of medical personnel to where Kenneth stood near the door. He hadn't left. He was watching the proceedings with icy detachment, his arms crossed over that massive chest. His eyes, no longer glowing but still an unsettling shade of Arctic blue, were fixed on me. He was tracking every movement the doctors made, a predator watching its injured prey being prodded. The woman approached me with a needle. I flinched. "Hold still," she said, not unkindly, just efficiently. She drew several vials of blood with terrifying speed. Then came the ultrasound machine. The woman lifted my shirt, squirting cold gel onto my stomach. I shivered, tears pricking my eyes. This was supposed to be a private moment. Something I did with Tyrell, maybe holding his hand, nervously laughing. Not here. Not surrounded by stone-faced strangers in a villain's lair while the villain himself watched from the corner. The machine beeped. Grey static filled the small monitor, turned away from me. The woman moved the wand around, her expression unreadable. The room went dead silent. The kind of silence where you can hear dust settle. The female doctor stopped moving the wand. She looked at the screen, then at her colleagues, and finally, reluctantly, toward Kenneth. "My king," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but in that acoustic vacuum it sounded like a shout. Kenneth took 1 step forward. The other 2 doctors immediately took 1 step back. "Report," he said. The single word dropped like a stone into water. The doctor hesitated. She looked down at me, a flicker of something like pity in her severe eyes, before turning back to the Ice King. "The subject is pregnant, as you suspected," she began, choosing her words carefully. "Approximately 8 weeks." Kenneth's expression didn't change, but the temperature in the room seemed to drop another 10 degrees. His nostrils flared slightly. "And?" he demanded. The underlying threat in his voice was palpable. "Tell me what I'm smelling." The doctor took a breath. "We ran a rapid genetic marker test based on the fetal cells in her blood sample." She paused, as if terrified to deliver the punchline. The fetus shows 0 markers for lycanthropy. It is completely, entirely human." I let out a shaky breath I didn't know I was holding. Of course it was human. Tyrell was a CPA who got hay fever. But Kenneth went absolutely still. It wasn't the stillness of before. This was the stillness of a bomb right before detonation. He stared at me. No, not at me. He stared at my stomach. The look on his face was terrifying. It was a collision of 2 massive opposing forces. On one side there was absolute aristocratic disgust. I was a human, carrying another human male's offspring inside his territory. By their rules I was pollution, a weakness, a biological insult. But beneath the disgust, something else was warring for dominance. His eyes were locked on my midsection with an intensity that burned. His hands down at his sides were flexing, fingers curling and uncurling. He had claimed me. He had roared "mine" to the world. His primal instincts had already decided I was under his protection, and now those instincts were screaming at him to protect the vulnerable life inside me, even as his rational, cold mind despised what it was. He was a king at war with his own biology, He looked up from my stomach and met my eyes. The sheer weight of his predatory gaze made me want to shrink into the examination table. He looked furious. He looked trapped. "Everyone out," he said. His voice was quiet, lethal. "Leave us." The 3 medtechs vanished like smoke in a hurricane. I didn't blame them. If a man who looked like he could bench press a Buick and shoot lasers from his eyes told me to leave, I'd be halfway to Jersey before he finished the sentence. Kenneth took their place at the foot of the examination table. He looked less like a doctor and more like a prosecuting attorney about to deliver a closing argument that involved a lot of jail time. He stared at me. Not at my face, but at the entirety of me, like I was a complex, irritating puzzle he'd been forced to solve. The silence stretched, thick and uncomfortable, broken only by the hum of the expensive medical equipment, and my own traitorous heart trying to beat its way out of my chest. "So," I said, my voice higher than I intended, "does this mean I get my phone back? Since I'm clearly just a boring human who wandered into the wrong party?" His eyes narrowed, just a fraction. "You are not boring, Liorah." He said my name like it was a distasteful flavor he was trying to identify. "You're a complication, an anomaly." He walked around the table, his movements predatory and controlled. He stopped right next to me, close enough that I could feel the heat radiating off him, smell that distinct scent of frost air, and, was that pine? Clinging to his expensive suit. "And you are pregnant," he stated, as if it were an accusation, "with a human child." I sat up, swinging my legs over the side of the table, wincing slightly as the cold air hit my bare skin where the shirt had ridden up. "Yeah, I gathered that. Newsflash, that's how human biology works. We tend to have human babies." "Not in my city," he snarled, the low growl returning to his voice. It wasn't the earth-shaking roar from before, but it was close enough to make my stomach do a terrified little flip. "Not in my territory. Human propagation is discouraged." "Discouraged?" I bristled, anger temporarily overriding fear. "What is this, some kind of twisted HOA with rules against pets and children? I didn't ask to be here, Kenneth. I didn't ask for any of this." He leaned in, placing a hand on the table on either side of my hips, effectively boxing me in. His face was inches from mine. His eyes were the color of a frozen lake, hard and unforgiving. "You are here," he said, his voice dangerously low, "because you were sent here, by a seer who foresaw something that required a human diversion." He paused, letting the weight of Angela's betrayal settle over me again. "And you are here," he continued, his voice dropping even lower, "because I claimed you, in front of witnesses, in front of a rival." I swallowed hard. "So, unclaim me. Let me go. I won't tell anyone. I'll sign an NDA. I'll move to another state. I'll name my kid after you, whatever you want. Just let me leave." He actually laughed. It wasn't a happy sound. It was a short, sharp bark of incredulity that sent a shiver down my spine. "Let you go?" he repeated, as if the concept was foreign to him. He leaned back slightly, assessing me with that cold, analytical gaze. "You are carrying a vulnerability in my city. A human child is fragile, easily exploited, a target for anyone who wishes to undermine my authority." He pushed off the table and began to pace, his stride long and agitated. "The rival pack, the one whose alpha I just educated, they will know. They will see you as a weakness, a way to get to me." "But I'm nothing to you," I argued, desperate. "I'm just some random human you grabbed. Why would they care?" He stopped pacing and turned to face me, his expression unreadable. "Because I claimed you, Liorah. In our world, a public claim is absolute. You are mine, to protect, to provide for, to manage." He said manage like it was a synonym for incarcerate. "Manage?" I choked out. "What does that mean?" He walked back to the table, his movements fluid and terrifyingly graceful. He didn't touch me, but his presence was suffocating. "It means," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion, "that you are my responsibility now, and you are a liability." He reached into the pocket of his suit jacket and pulled out a sleek black smartphone. Not mine. Mine was currently modern art on his living room floor. He tapped the screen a few times, then held it out to me. "You can call your mate," he said, the word dripping with distaste. "Inform him that you are safe, that you will be unavailable for an indefinite period." I stared at the phone, then at him. "Unavailable? Are you serious? Tyrell is going to call the police. He's going to file a missing persons report." "Let him," Kenneth said coldly. "The police in this city answer to me. Your mate will be told you are on an extended business trip, or perhaps a wellness retreat. He will believe what he is told to believe." My blood ran cold. "You can't just erase me." "I can do whatever I deem necessary to protect my territory," he said, his voice flat. "And right now, that includes you and the parasite you carry." Parasite, he called my baby a parasite. Something inside me snapped. It wasn't the fear anymore. It wasn't the confusion. It was pure, molten rage. I snatched the phone from his hand, not to call Tyrell, to throw it at his arrogant, ice-sculpted face. I stopped myself just in time. Throwing things at superpowered apex predators was probably a bad life choice. Instead, I stood up, sliding off the table so we were face to face. Well, face to chest. "Listen here, you overgrown husky," I hissed, poking him hard in the center of that immaculate silk shirt. "My baby is not a parasite, and I am not your property. You can keep me locked up in your ivory tower, you can threaten me with your glow-in-the-dark eyes, but you do not own me. Do you understand?" He didn't move. He didn't even blink. He just looked down at my finger poking his chest, as if it were a mildly interesting insect. Then, slowly, terrifyingly, the corner of his mouth twitched upwards. It wasn't a smile. It was a baring of teeth. A challenge accepted. "We shall see," he said, his voice a low rumble that I felt in my own chest. "We shall see, little human." He turned on his heel and walked out of the medical bay, the doors sliding shut behind him with a finality that echoed in the silence. I was alone again. Locked in a billionaire werewolf's penthouse, pregnant with a human baby he considered a biological insult, and apparently his prisoner indefinitely. I looked down at the phone in my hand. It was brand new, unlocked, full battery. I dialed Tyrell's number. It went straight to voicemail. "Hey, babe," I said into the receiver, my voice shaking only a little. "It's me. Listen, something came up, big work thing, totally unexpected. I'm going to be tied up for a while. Don't worry about me. I'm safe. I love you." I hung up before he could ask questions, before I could break down. I wasn't going to break down. Not here, not in front of him. I looked around the sterile room, then at the closed elevator doors. "Okay, Ice King. You want to play house? Let's play." I walked over to the cabinet where the medical supplies were kept. I found a box of latex gloves and a small, wicked-looking scalpel. I pocketed both. Then I walked to the elevator and pressed the button for the penthouse level. If I was going to be a prisoner, I was going to be the most inconvenient, irritating, human baby-having prisoner this city had ever seen. Starting with finding the goddamn oat milk.
I see your shadow when I close my eyes. Every road I take still leads to you somehow. They say our timing's wrong, our worlds collide, but my heart never learned how to back down. We're standing still on a moving line, afraid to fall, afraid to fly, but every breath I hold inside whispers your name like a crime. What if we don't fight the feeling? What if we let it burn bright? Even if the world keeps breaking us, I'd still choose you. Every night they can say it's wrong, say we'll fall apart, say love like ours risk it all for this life. They draw the lines, they choose the rules, tell us who we're meant to be. But love was never meant to be quiet, and you feel like destiny. If I reach out, will you run or stay? If I jump, will you jump my way? I'm tired of living half alive, pretending this fire will someday die. So if the night comes crashing down and doubt gets louder than our names, I'll still be here, hand in yours, believing love was worth the pain. Even if the stars refuse to shine, I choose you.